Hello and welcome to Avasant's Digital Forum, Computer Economics, Worldwide IT Spending and Staffing Outlook for 2021. My name is Andriana Albert and I will be your MC today. As a thank you to everyone who is joining us today, you will receive a complimentary copy of our new full report, Worldwide IT Spending and Staffing Outlook 2021. As we aim to make these sessions as interactive as possible, we encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A features on your dashboard to pose questions to the panelists. They will be answering your questions live throughout the hour. A replay of Avasant's digital forum, as well as the presenter slides, will be emailed to all attendees. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. Frank Scavo is a partner and president of research at Avasant. Dave Wagner is Senior Research Director at Avasant. He is also the author of the report we will be discussing today. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Andriana. Good to be here.
So Frank, it occurred to me that we probably should have put a brief slide describing computer economics to our audience before we start. Would you like to just give a brief overview of what computer economics is?
I will be very happy to do that. So computer economics is an integral part of Avasant research. The computer economics was acquired by Avasant last year, right around this time, and Dave and I came on board as part of that. So we specialize especially around IT spending and staffing benchmarks, technology trends, outsourcing statistics, salary data, and so on. We really specialize in research and data around the financial management of IT and the strategic management of IT within the business. So the firm originally was founded in 1979. We've been conducting this IT spending and staffing survey since 1990. Dave and I were not there back then. We got involved later. And we've brought all of this rich data and this history into Avasant Research and now offer it through Avasant Research. So we're very happy. This survey that we are talking about today is actually not our main IT spending survey. It's actually like a mid-year kind of update. We conduct this around the end of the fourth quarter of the year as kind of an outlook at what IT executives are expecting in terms of staffing and spending changes in the coming year. So it's kind of giving us a midterm update and a look into the future on what we're expecting. We're actually now involved with our annual survey. We started in January. So as a little side note, and I think at the end, Dave, I think we give a link to that. If any of the attendees on this digital forum would like to participate in the annual survey, we'll make it worth your while, as we say. So, so please consider joining and contributing to our research. We are offering this, as Andriana mentioned, we're offering the report that we're covering today to all the attendees, but there's a lot more if you participate in our annual survey that's in progress right now.
Great, thanks, Frank. Andriana, could you go ahead to the next slide, please? Excuse me. As Frank said, this is our 2021 outlook for the year. We've done this one for about a decade. We start surveying in about October every year to December of the year going forward. And just to start off, let's address the elephant in the room. 2020 did not go as anybody expected. When we went into 2020 last year, it's the fall of 2019, most of us had never heard of COVID-19. Those of us who had heard of it knew it as something that was going on in China. Right. We were wondering whether it would come here. We didn't know. We found out in retrospect it was already here, but we did not know. We certainly did not know that it was going to cause a global pandemic and a complete disruption of everything that was going on in our business and our lives. What is funny is that our prediction last year for 2020 was that it was going to be a positive year, but there were rumblings of problems. So it turns out that it was more than a rumble. So when we're looking at the outlook for 2021, you need to put it in the context of when we ask this question that you'll see that is related to this slide. The question is essentially, do you think 2021 is going to be a better year than 2020? Or for the 2020 data, of course, it was, do you think 2020 is going to be better than 2019? What is fascinating is that the numbers are really very similar from year to year. But you need to take that with a grain of salt, because the folks who were answering that 2020 question really did not expect a pandemic. So those in 2021 are really looking forward to hopefully what will be a better year with therapeutics, vaccines, mask wearing, social distancing, all the things that are helping us get back to normal. So there's a real question. Next slide, please. Is 2021 just a repeat of 2020? Is it a mulligan? Are we going to go forward saying, well, 2020 is just a disruption and now we're going to go back to the plans that we had before? Or are we going to look at 2021 as an entirely new year with a new set of opportunities and growth opportunities? Next slide, please. And the answer is, it depends on where you lie. For those golfers out there like me and Frank, you've probably ended up in this position.
I spend a lot of time right where that guy is, right there.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time there
Walk
too.
in the woods.
Yeah. And that's the truth, right? Depending on your particular company, your particular business, your particular place within that sector, your outlook for 2021 is going to vary immensely. And that's what we're really going to be talking about here, is that there are companies that are poised, companies that are sitting on the fairway, as it were, poised to look at 2021 as a big growth year. And there are companies like this poor guy who are stuck in the woods. And maybe it's their fault. Maybe they didn't handle their digital transformation well enough. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe they're in a sector that just simply can't cope because it requires physical presence. I don't think the airline industry is suddenly going to switch to virtual airplanes to allow for travel, for instance. They're just going to struggle. So that's the main theme we're going to talk about here, is really that variation between companies and even within the same sector.
That's right.
And what we typically do, but to talk about that, is to talk about budgets and headcount. But before we do that, I've been talking for a while. Frank, why don't you talk to me about what you think are the main impacts of 2020 that are going to echo through 2021 for companies?
Well, that's a good question. And one thing I noticed that you said about the rumblings at the beginning of 2020, as if the survey respondents, had some inklings of what the pandemic was going to do. And actually, when you go back and look at when we did that survey, Dave, that was really prior to any talk about a pandemic. So, and we watched, what's coming back from that survey every year is very predictive. I mean, there were concerns about, and we even wrote about that last year, that there were signs that there could be maybe not an economic recession, but definitely a pullback in economic growth. And as it turns out, of course, the pandemic did hit us, and just was it just upset everything. I mean, there were so many, one of the things I've been saying to some of my analyst friends is that anybody that thinks they're in the prediction business after 2020 better, better retire.
I guess I should retire then.
Well, I mean, we don't, like you and I, we don't make predictions. We make projections based upon data that we're seeing in the market, right? But people, I mean, I don't know of a single industry analyst that predicted the pandemic. I mean, not a one, right? I mean, I've said in a previous digital forum that I've been obsessed with pandemics for a long time. I wrote a report 10 years ago about business continuity under pandemic conditions, because of the bird flu. I didn't see this coming, until I heard about what was happening in China, that there would even be a possibility here. But it just upset the whole apple cart. And now we're coming back 12 years later and starting, over again and saying, what's the difference? What's it going to be like, going forward? And I think what you said was, everybody always asks us about, well, what sectors are going to benefit, what sectors are going to suffer, and you can't do it at a sector level. You can't, identify the effects of the pandemic, except for a few exceptions. And I was thinking about that. One, Dave, you're very familiar with is higher education, right?
Yep.
It's hard to think of any higher education institution, except if it's an online university, that might be, not suffering from the pandemic, because, many of them are not conducting, the admissions are down, reimbursements are down, tuitions are down, right? And so there's not much exception there. State and local governments is another one that are under tremendous pressure because of declining tax revenues and so on. And all of this, our study is on IT spending and staffing, right? Eventually, all of this hits the IT budget and the IT staffing, right?
Exactly. So let's go ahead and actually look at those budgets. Next slide, please. So this is the expectation for changes in IT operational budgets worldwide. I should tell you, all of our numbers here are worldwide. We've done this for a reason. In previous years, we separated the US and Canada data, the European data, worldwide data in this study. What we found is over the years, the numbers really started to converge. It's a global economy. There isn't a particular region of the world anymore that is, say, behind or ahead the way we would have thought about it before. There really is now just a global economy with similar pressures throughout the world, particularly in a pandemic year like this. There's no country that's really escaping this unless you're amazing like New Zealand, where not only do you have a great government, but an island that helps you hold back the virus. So with that in mind, all of these numbers are going to be worldwide. And what you'll see here is that at the median, budgets are increasing 3%. Operational budgets are increasing 3%. That's a healthy number, to be honest. That's higher than it was last year. It is typically where we see over in the cloud era, the last, say, 10 years, we've seen budget increases expected to be around 2 to 3%. 3% is a good number, particularly with global inflation. Most countries, there've been very little inflation, sometimes flat. We've even seen a little deflation in some nations in Europe. So 3% is a very healthy increase. But this comes with a few caveats, right, Frank? The first is you'll note that the 25th percentile is seeing budget cuts. You don't typically see a healthy rate, a healthy increase in budgets at the median and a decrease at the 25th percentile. That is rare, and it shows you that certain companies are really struggling. The other thing is we need to remember, and Frank, I think you'd be really great to comment on this. We need to remember that a lot of companies were forced to cut their budgets in the middle of 2020 in response to the pandemic. So this 3% at the median really is kind of masking that some companies may have had to take deep cuts last year, right, Frank?
That's right. It's hard to tell sometimes, depending on when the fiscal year ends and so on, how a respondent is necessarily answering this question. So if they're looking at, their budget, say mid-year last year, and what's it look like for this year, they might be saying, they might be at that 75th percentile, say, oh, we're going to have a huge increase. Yeah, but, at this time last year, it might have been flat. So it's a directionally significant observation here. And the thing I was going to add also, Dave, is that, I've been around with this data long enough to remember at the beginning of the 2000s and even at the end of the 1990 decade, these numbers would be conservative. I mean, we saw double-digit increases in the beginning of the, millennium.
Yeah.
So, but since, the mid-2000s, it's really moderated. Budget growth is not, we don't have these big boom and bust years like we used to have. And you kind of mentioned it a minute ago, because of the transition to the cloud and increased efficiencies within IT, there's been a kind of moderating influence organizations, and we're going to get into digital transformation, are starting to realize increasing benefits from IT without having these massive spending increases, except if you're in a period of, rolling out major systems and so on. So, but it is different. This year is different. Like you said, we don't usually see budget cuts of the 25th percentile when you have a healthy growth of the median. You see it below the 25th percent. There's always some companies that are cutting budget, but there is a divergence this year, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute.
Yeah, we are. But just to put a point on what you're saying, if you cut your budget 10% in the summer last year because of the virus, you're increasing it 3%. You're not even above water yet.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And we
Right.
saw, some of you may have even attended, hopefully, we did 2 webinars in the middle of the pandemic last year that showed roughly a third of companies were forced to make cuts to their IT budgets in the middle of the pandemic to respond to what was going on. And the median cut there, I believe, was about 10%. So that is going to be something that's, at 3% increases, it's going to take a few years to get your head back above your 2020 numbers if you had to take that cut. And as Frank said, every year we track that a certain number of companies are taking budget cuts. Andriana, if you flip the slide, we'll see that's a major difference this year. So, excuse me. So what you'll see here is that not an indifferent number of companies are increasing their budgets. In 2020, it was 60%. 2021 is 56. That's not shockingly different. What is very different is the 27% of companies that are decreasing their operational budgets this year is the highest since the Great Recession. So it is very clear that we are in some sort of recession. Unemployment in the US is hovering over 8%. In Europe, it's similar. Even in China, where they're not in a recession, they're certainly in a slowdown of growth. So worldwide, we're seeing economic conditions have obviously been impacted by the pandemic. And so the number of companies decreasing, that is a very high number. Frank, there are kind of 2 reasons why you'd be cutting the budget now, right? One is, of course, you're just struggling to survive, right? You're in an industry that just is struggling. The other one may be because you're worried about how long this recession is going to be, right? And you're trying to save cash. Is that typical? You were around in this business in the last recession. I was not. Did you? Is this a typical amount of decrease for this phase in a recession?
Well, no 2 recessions are alike, either for the cause or the duration. And I remember the thing that kind of surprised me the last time was how long there was this lingering effect after, well into as I recall, the recession was 2008 and 2009, I think, is the official Bureau of Economic Analysis dates for the recession. But as I recall, we saw lingering effects into the 2010, even I think into 2011. It wasn't until about 2012 that we started seeing the, more healthy, growth in IT budgets. So to see this, increasing number at the 60% or, 56% to me is encouraging. And I think there's, a lot more going on than just response to the recession. It's response to the pandemic conditions and what companies are having to do to become more resilient, more agile, and more transformative to the business. And I think that's what we're seeing, in the survey responses and the comments we're hopefully going to talk about at some point.
Right. Well, what this indicates in a lot of ways, I think, is, there are different types of recoveries from recession, right? And we talk about the shapes and wheelbarrow recoveries, et cetera. This one looks like it really is shaping up to be what they call a K-shaped recovery, right?
Right.
Companies that are increasing their revenue because they're so-called winners of this economy, right? They're poised to handle the new conditions. And there are so-called losers in this economy who either by fault of their own or by fault of their sector, are really struggling to get by. This would be a great time to take questions. Andriana, I think you said we had a question.
We do have a question. Let me pull it up for you. Can you share the typical budget mix of personnel to vendors to tech fees and how each of those are trending as well?
Let me take a first shot at this, Dave. What are you thinking about this? I saw this message in the chat and I'm thinking, let me think about this for a minute. Well, typically, no great secret, IT is a people business. So typically, and this number has actually, as I recall, been increasing over the years. Typically, the typical corporate IT budget is between 40 and 50% going toward personnel. So people say, oh, we're so much for, application systems, so much for hardware. The biggest line item in the IT budget is people. So that leaves, everything else, for the other 50 to 60%. Now, how much of that is service providers? I think, was that the question? Personnel to vendors and tech fees was the, so by vendors, if you mean like hardware and software providers, typically application software is about, Dave, what, 12 to 15% of the IT budget.
Yeah, depending on the sector, that's a good number. Yeah.
Hardware has been declining. Data centers are only about 10 to 12% of, and that includes data center hardware and software. How much of that goes to outside service providers depends highly upon the service delivery strategy. So, we have organizations, we have Avasant clients that are, nearly 100% outsourced for their IT organizations, others that have just a very small percent. You cut across all organizations, Dave, in our study, it's somewhere between 5 and 10% goes to outside service providers on average, but their variation on that is huge, right?
Yes.
So hard to, just like what we talked about a minute ago, hard to say one size fits all on that.
Right, and to add to that, when you're talking about IT staffing specifically, which is what computer economics focuses on, the percentage of budget dedicated to personnel in the IT staff has actually been decreasing as companies have adopted the cloud, SaaS, other infrastructure advantages. They're getting more efficient. They don't need as many people to run the business. And they want to, a lot of companies want to get out of the data center business. They want to get out of their infrastructure. So in terms of specifically in IT, I think you're probably going to see more of the budget being dedicated to outsourcing, vendors, cloud, SaaS, et cetera, as we move forward. Is that fair to say, Frank?
That's right. That's right. And the mix, I don't know if we're talking about that later, but the mix in the IT staff is definitely shifting from kind of infrastructure support services to higher level application development, business analysis, project management, vendor management, kind of higher level, skills. And the lower level, infrastructure and so on is, increasingly, it's easier to outsource that, because it's more of a commodity. So definitely some long-term shifts here.
Great. Andriana, any other questions at the moment, or should we?
We do have another one.
Yeah. Great.
So there is a shift to the cloud as the technology enabler, and IT ops budgets are increasing / correcting from pre-pandemic. What is your opinion on the leakage of the IT ops budget to LOBs as cloud solutions enable business units to be more sufficient with proper governance?
So Dave, this is talking about what we call IT spending outside the IT budget. Some people refer to that as shadow IT. I don't like that term because in my experience in consulting and talking to survey respondents, they know what spending is outside the IT budget, and it's not in the shadows. It's clearly in the open. And it's done because the budget authority, they want to align more closely with the business that's using that service. So, the typical example I always give is a human capital management system that is a SaaS, provider, whether it be Oracle, SAP, Workday, ADP, whatever. It's clearly an IT expense, but it's paid for by the business unit, not because it's being done apart from IT governance, but because they're aligning that budgetary authority with the business unit that actually consumes that service. So yes, I think the questioner who asked this, I think there is a long-term trend to more of a federated model for IT spending where the business units pick up more of these costs. And some of that's because there are, new tools that they can deploy, low code, no code, business analysis, business intelligence tools that they can deploy directly, in some cases develop their own departmental systems. But it's very important that that continue to be, have proper governance so that you have the proper integration, you don't have fragmentation of IT services. Would you say that's relevant, Dave?
Yeah, in fact, I've been wanting for more than a year, just haven't had time to do a study on this very thing. We're definitely seeing that increase, and we need to get a handle not only on what's increasing, but how to manage it correctly. So
Right.
hopefully, fingers crossed, sometime this year you'll see a study like that from computer economics.
We've been gathering that data now for a number of years, so we actually can do some trends on that and see if
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the trend is towards more and more of what we call outside spending, shadow IT, whatever, budget leakage, whatever you want to call it. It's the same general concept, and it's definitely growing.
That's right.
So this is a good time to jump back in, because I think the cloud is going to become the next sort of theme we're going to be talking about here. Before we switch to the next slide, though, really the thing that is becoming very clear to us as we did this study is that the companies that were already working on their digital transformation, the companies that had their ducks in a row or were able to change quickly to a digital model were the ones who thrived during 2020. The reality is the pandemic changed everything about the way we work, the way we buy and sell in our own houses, the way we consume entertainment. Everything has changed. But what is interesting is that the actual, and go ahead, Andriana, and go to the next slide, the actual trends in spending really haven't changed. They've accelerated. We knew in 2018 and 2019 that these were necessary changes, that our spending, our digital transformation, our cloud transformation were key to moving forward. There wasn't a company that wasn't aware of that. It's a question of how quickly they could get there. So what you're going to see on these next two charts are the spending priorities by budget and spending priorities by initiatives. The way these are done is it's the net percentage of companies that are increasing their budget versus decreasing their budget. So what you're seeing there is essentially 75% of the companies that we surveyed are increasing their budgets in this area, or excuse me, if you take the number that are increasing and subtract the number that are decreasing, the number is 75.8%. And the same with all of these other areas. And these 5 priorities would have been the same last year, the year before, the year before. But nonetheless, we're seeing a real acceleration, particularly 2 areas, security and end user devices. And that makes sense, because what happened very early on in March, in April, we saw companies needing to move to a remote work paradigm. And remote work meant a few things. It meant extending the security perimeter because everybody was working from home, and it meant getting everybody a laptop. We had a great quote from somebody who took our coronavirus survey in the summer last year. He said, "We went from 14 employees working from home to 14,000 on a Tuesday."
A lot of laptops.
So that's the kind of massive change that happened this year. And I'm sure all of you on the call went through you all have your own war stories about that. But so we're seeing increases in end user device budgets for the first time actually in quite a while, because the PCs have become longer living, and even mobile devices are longer living than they were even just a few years ago. Virtual desktop and SaaS and those things are also increasing the life. But suddenly we had to put equipment in the hands of employees at home. We needed to increase our network spending to accommodate that new traffic. Really, the only area that we're not seeing any increase in is not a surprise. It's the data center infrastructure because of the cloud. Frank, is there anything here? I mean, I know I covered a little bit of all of these, but is there anything here that really stood out as an important aspect of 2020, or more importantly, what we're going to need for 2021 going forward that we can carry as the area we really need to think about?
Well, I think you've touched on it already. I went through the comments from the survey respondents again yesterday and today just to see, let me remember what they were actually saying, not just the statistics, but what was behind it. And I was really impressed again at how many of them mentioned security as an area where they were really spending more time and effort and money. And it's for the reason you said, is that any seams that you had in your security profile were exposed during the pandemic. One of the areas that I know we heard during our pandemic survey last year was the VPN usage. So companies that were relying upon mostly an internal or hosted data center infrastructure needed to allow remote access to that, and that is almost always done through a VPN. And if you've ever worked with VPNs, they're not that easy, especially setting them up on your home computer and your home network to connect with your employer data center services. There's not a very friendly technology, and it generates a lot of calls to the help desk, resetting passwords, helping people walk through the configurations. And that just accelerates the move to the cloud, because when you move to the cloud, you're getting out of the VPN business as well. I'm not a security SME, so somebody can serve to correct me on this, but companies that were more cloud-based infrastructure had a much easier time with this, because whether you're accessing the cloud systems from your physical office or from home is really not a lot of difference. So, but still today at this survey, people are still saying about increased investments in security and privacy. So I think that's definitely going to take some time to work through that.
Right. What is it about the pandemic? I mean, I think I have some opinions on this too, but what is it about the pandemic that really ramps up the security issue even more? Is it merely that increased perimeter that we're working from home, or are there other issues?
It's a heterogeneous environment now. I mean, I'm sitting here in a pretty well-equipped home office, but guess what? I've got a commercial grade residential home router accessed through my local cable company. Well, my employer may not have any idea what that equipment looks like. It may not have been replaced, in the last 5 years. I do, but who updates their home router firmware? Hardly anybody, right? So suddenly, the CISO staff has got, a whole bunch of heterogeneous environments to take care of to secure those home offices. And, I heard from one client, it's a university medical center that sent everybody to work from home. Well, guess what? They got huge HIPAA privacy concerns, because now these, their HIPAA procedures say you don't take home patient files. They stay in the office. Well, now, fine, they put them all into PDFs and they're accessing them, and they're doing interviews with patients over the phone. And well, who else is in the living room or in their home office when they're doing that? That's a HIPAA violation. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences to moving people to work from home, in both in terms of security and privacy.
Yeah, compliance is a real issue there. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't get most people to change their passwords, much less update their firmware. and it's not only updating it, here's a situation where as an organization, you don't own necessarily the equipment, right? You certainly don't own the router, and you may
it's BYOD all the way down.
Exactly. So it creates real issues. And at the same time, You mentioned the help desk having to deal with more tickets because of all that. The help desk is trying to figure out how to do all of this from home too. So it's a catch-22. They're trying to work out their technology issues at the same time they're trying to work out others.
That's right.
So that's a nice overview of the budget issues. But now on the next slide, please, Andriana, we'll see some of these specific initiatives that are at the heart of all this. And one of the things, a theme that we see constantly in the comments, I feel like, is the only way through the downturn is to get through the downturn, right? Is you need to spend your way through this. IT is the solution to the problem. It's not this is a different reality for CIOs than previous recessions. During the Great Recession, it was still very much a perception that IT was a cost center. And this is the first recession we're seeing where IT is a strategic solution to the problem. And I think that's a real difference that we can't forget when we talk about the outlook for this year and beyond. There are companies that are struggling to find revenue, and they will cut everything else before they'll cut the IT budget, because the IT budget is the way through this. As we mentioned before, quarantines changed the way we work, the way we shop, the way we do everything else. Customers are expecting to interact with businesses on new channels, mobile and other channels that maybe they had adopted in small amounts before, social. They're adopting on an entirely new level because it's the only way to interact. In a lot of places, the retail stores have been until very recently closed to foot traffic. So they've been interacting before. I get an Amazon box every day now. I'm ruining the planet all by myself, one cardboard box at a time. And everybody else is. And so when you look at this chart here, again, it works the same as the net percentage companies increasing their spending by this initiative versus decreasing. Again, the order of this chart has not changed for 4 or 5 years, with one exception. Digital transformation actually has been rising in the last few years, which is obviously a good thing. But generally speaking, the top 5 have been the same for many years. Cloud applications has been at the top for as long as I have worked at computer economics. Business intelligence and cloud infrastructure are always right there at 2 or 3. So you see, these businesses are adopting these very initiatives for the very same reason they were in 2019, but they're doing it faster, right, Frank? That's the big difference, is the speed, right?
That's right. And one thing, we've been emphasizing that some companies are in poor shape, economically because of, where they are, where they lie, like you said, but they still need to spend to get out of the recession. And one thing we haven't mentioned, I don't think anywhere, that actually helps quite a bit is that for whatever reason right now, interest rates are very low. So it's possible for even companies that are financially in difficult times can still make these investments in digital transformation to get through the recession they may be in, because they can borrow money at very, very low rates. And it does allow them to make those investments they need to get through the recession. So, I think this whole stimulus situation here in the US and other worldwide economies, we're definitely seeing it, the way it's affecting how companies are prioritizing their investments, because they can make those investments even though they're having to be very conservative otherwise.
Right. Is there anything on this list you feel like isn't high enough? For instance, I kind of wonder a little bit about that business continuity number. I would have thought that the pandemic really would have taught us that business continuity is something we want to invest in. Is it that actually we got through this pretty well, that they aren't increasing their business continuity budgets? Or is there anything else on here that stands out that you're surprised isn't higher or lower?
some things that have to do with disaster recovery might be disguised as security spending, because a security incident, in a sense, can be a disaster, right? So some of the investments they're making, they may be categorizing in their minds as security investments, but they're actually a big element of disaster recovery or business continuity. So I think like we say, all these dots are connected, right? But yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think you would expect to see more of that. It may be that companies are waiting to get through the current, situation before they make, kind of wholesale changes in business continuity. The other thing that also contributes to that is that, as you move to cloud applications and cloud infrastructure, that has a built-in element of business continuity or disaster recovery in it, right? You're now no longer, if you're hosted on, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, they provide that business continuity or disaster recovery as a service. So again, it could be, kind of hiding in those line items as well.
Right. Well, and it is surprising to me how resilient the economy really has been. I mean, as bad as it has been, it still surprises me that how the transition was extremely painful. And I'm not trying to take away the effort that anybody put into doing it, but it was surprisingly fast as well. It was amazing how quickly we were able to, as a global economy, shift every worker's physical position and still keep the lights on, literally. Keep the lights on and refill the grocery stores and do all of those things in a completely new business process in a very short period of time. It shows how resilient we really were. So maybe we don't need to increase the budget that much. And again, not to take away from the effort of everyone on this call. I know how hard that was to pull off, but the fact that we could pull it off is just a miracle that, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we would have really struggled to do the same thing.
That's right.
Right. So Adriana, this is a good natural place to take any questions if there are some.
Yes, we do have more questions. Okay, given the decrease in data center spend, what percentage of companies are moving to public cloud and how many are just reducing/consolidating their data center footprint?
Let me take a first shot at that, Dave. I'm not seeing a lot of data center consolidation pick up in terms of new initiatives this year, because I think there are bigger priorities. But there is, as Dave has mentioned, a long-term shift, as we all know, to cloud applications, and now especially cloud infrastructure. So when we first started, tracking infrastructure as a service, it might have been 10 years ago. I mean, it was like 5-7% of organizations that implemented anything like, Amazon or Microsoft Azure was just, basically in its early stages. Google Cloud was, I think, just starting as well. Now, Dave, that number is up to about at least 40 or 50% of organizations are relying heavily on cloud infrastructure, not just cloud applications like Salesforce, Workday, and so on, but actually building out cloud infrastructure to replace on-premises infrastructure. So there's definitely been a strong shift in that direction. We see it every year. That's a steady increase, year to year.
Right. And what is true though is we track workload percentage in the cloud, and it is going up every year. There's a lot of room in most companies to grow. I mean, there are companies that are 75, 80, 90, 100% cloud. There always are. There are companies born 100% in the cloud, right? There are an awful lot of companies sitting at 10, 15, 20%. I believe the average of our entire sample is about 20%. So there's a lot of room still to grow in the cloud. So I think you're just going to see it continue to accelerate for quite some time. Anything else at the moment, Adriana?
Yep, we have a couple more. Where is the budget money not being spent on infra? To the big titans, Snow, SFDC, AWS, etc. I assume the budgets of these companies are excluded from these numbers.
Yeah, I understand that question. Actually, I think I understand what this person is asking about. We should have said this earlier. Our survey is largely deliberately toward end user organizations, not IT service providers, because that's a whole different, obviously IT spending of an IT service provider. If we do take them in our survey, we're very strict that they have to only count their internal IT support costs, not their service delivery to customers. So that's a good, I mean, IT spending as a global, industry, as a number, includes not only end user organizations, but IT service providers and even IT product manufacturers that are producing IT products that go to consumers. So that's a bigger number. So when you look at, some other research firms that report IT spending worldwide or technology spending worldwide, they're talking about the market, right? We're not talking about the market. We're not taking a market view. We're taking an inside the CIO view, right, of what the CIO is spending within the organization and how much of revenue is going toward IT. So it's a different view. Hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think you covered it really well there, Frank. Thanks. Andriana, would you go to the next slide? We've got about 2 or 3 more, and then we can finish the rest of the show on questions. We just wanted to cover briefly. I think this is an important change here. Hiring, IT staff headcount is another area we track every year. And over the recent 5 years or so, IT staff headcount has not increased significantly. And the reason for that, we believe, is the adoption of cloud, SaaS, other infrastructure saving kinds of jobs. And within that, of course, there's churn and there's change in the staff mix, the IT staffing mix. We've seen fewer infrastructure jobs, but we're seeing an increase in customer-facing jobs or jobs that face the internal stakeholders. Those are going up. But the overall total IT staff headcount has not really changed significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. It's really been held back. As you see here, 49% of companies are expecting to increase their headcounts this year. That's not a particularly robust number, but it's the highest number in 5 years, which is important to point out.
Yeah.
Because when something gets healthier, it's always important to point out. And that expected cut of 14% is very low for a recession. It's lower than last year.
Dave, that's not a recession. When we've been in real recessions like 28, 29, that number approaches 50%.
Absolutely. Yep.
50% of IT organizations are cutting IT staff. That's an IT recession. We're not in an IT recession right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that was the point I was driving to, Frank, is that if you're really looking at the IT outlook for 2021, this I think is the best evidence of all the things we've provided to show that IT spending, or that IT strategy in general, the information technology, the digital capabilities of a company are the way through. So the companies may be laying off 10,000 workers, but they're trying real hard not to lay off their IT staff. They see IT as the solution to the problem, and I think that's really an important thing to drive home at this point for 2021. Frank, anything to add to that besides what you already?
No, just I think to emphasize this point, if you wanted to cut your IT budget, guess where the easiest place to do that is to lay off people. Right? Because you've got, software maintenance fees, you've got hardware lease, you got facility costs. Those are fixed costs. You can't cut those in the short term. You cut those in the long term. But if you want to make a cut in your IT budget, first place you're able to do that, apart from like travel and entertainment, which, is not a big percentage anyway, is cutting people costs. So the fact that not only we're not seeing a lot of cuts, we're seeing increases means that, like I said a minute ago, there is not an IT recession this year.
Yeah, no, I agree. Though I should say, before we get too overboard, the IT staff growth at the median is only 2%.
Very modest.
So not to get overly exuberant, but this is an important takeaway, I think. is that people are considered to be a part of this IT solution.
That's right.
Andriana, can you go ahead to the next slide? This is our outsourcing for 2021 plans. This is relatively modest, to be perfectly honest. 37.6% are planning to increase their budget against 20% that are decreasing. So we'll see a modest increase in outsourcing for 2021. But it is a little surprising considering we've been talking about digital transformation and new skills and all of these things helping to solve the problem. What is interesting is that companies aren't necessarily going to service vendors as a way of supplementing that as much as I would have expected. Frank, any thoughts on that?
No, just the only thing that occurs to me looking at this again is that these may not be short-term, transitions, right? So many IT outsourcing contracts are for, few of them are for a year. They're, more like 3, 5, 7 years. And so you may be in the middle of a contract and you're reevaluating what that means, but it doesn't mean you can necessarily change that over the short term. So I think we're going to see shifts in the types of outsourcing, where the services are delivered. And those are going to be more, longer term shifts as companies, rearrange post-pandemic.
Great. Next slide, Andriana, please. So I think we've really kind of hit home on this point already, but I just want to show it to you as our last budget takeaway. This is the operational budget growth forecast by major sectors. And what is important to note here is that there are a lot of sectors that their net growth is zero. But realistically, this is an incredibly difficult thing to predict in a given year, and particularly this year. And it's particularly difficult because within sectors, things are entirely different. For instance, take restaurants, just as one example. If you're a takeout restaurant right now, you're doing pretty well. If you're a sit-down restaurant that relies on luxury spending, you're really struggling right now. Your mileage is going to vary, as they say, and really forecasting by sector is not the best way to do it. Though I will point out that increase in professional technical services shows, I think, a legitimate reality that that's a sector that probably isn't as affected by the economic conditions or the pandemic conditions as much as some of the other areas. Frank, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you not to comment. We got about 5 minutes left. And I think the next slide is probably a slide that we should focus on a little more before the end.
Okay.
So Andriana, could you switch to that, please? So we have some common themes for 2021 that we think we've heard over and over again from our respondents that is really important to them as they go through 2021. I'm not going to read the chart here, you can see them, but Frank, I'd like you to concentrate on one or two that you think are the most important takeaways for 2021, please.
Well, I talked just a minute about those outsourcing contracts and service provider relationships, the third bullet on here. And I think one of the things we've seen is, many of you may know, Avasant is a big part of our businesses in strategic sourcing, an advisor to organizations that are outsourcing services, whether they be IT services or business process outsourcing. We're seeing a lot of our clients reevaluating those relationships. And one of the things that this pandemic has underscored, and I mentioned this a minute ago, is not only what you're outsourcing, but where those services are delivered. And organizations are seeing that if I have a service provider that is a local service provider providing services, and they can no longer work in my facility, then it doesn't matter if they're down the street or across the ocean. So I think the offshore service delivery is becoming much more attractive because, as we all know, there is often labor arbitrage that makes it more cost effective to deliver it overseas than it is to deliver it down the street. Whatever advantages were realized by having a local service provider now been largely mitigated because of the remote working situation. So that's one thing. And another thing we're seeing with some of our clients is that they're also applying this to even their what they call the retained organization, the part of their IT organization that they keep retain in-house, even when they're outsourcing a business function. That they're also seeing, we don't necessarily need, for global organizations, they don't necessarily need to have that local. They can move that into more in one of their territories that's more cost-effective delivery. So there's a shift not only in what work's being done, but where it's delivered. So I think that's one thing that is very important here. And then of course, digital transformation. I'll kick it back to you, Dave. You wanted to comment on any of these?
Yeah, I'd like to make a pitch for rethinking the workspace too. A lot of estimates, including our own, are showing that we think about 50% of the workforce is going to stay home full-time or at least more than 3 days a week. That really vastly changes the physical space of your office, whether that means you shrink your footprint to save money, or whether it means you rethink the space, literally around collaboration and around how to accommodate the fact that part of your team is at home, part of your team is in the office. I really think that right now, if you're not already back at the office, depending on where you are in the region, rethinking that physical space to reduce the cubicle farms and the just row after row of desk to create a more collaborative space, the space that works for hybrid work. I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about. The fact that nobody's in the office really helps to change that.
Right.
Andriana, I know we have questions and I'd love to answer them, but if you could switch to the next slide. I would just like to make a quick pitch to apply for our IT spending survey. We're doing it right now. Frank, do you want to actually do that pitch? You've probably pitched that more than I ever have.
Well, we're every year it's a challenge to gain enough survey respondents to deliver an adequate sample. So we're always looking for survey participants. The link is there. If you can't quite copy it down, email Andriana, respond to us. We'll send you the link. Apply for the survey. Again, focused on end user IT organizations. We will make it worth your while. We're going to share the composite results of the statistics, the survey. You'll see IT spending as a percent of revenue per user, a line item breakdown, salary, staffing positions, and so on. We also have some other reports, including once a month, we send you our report of the month, which is what we consider our best report for that month, and you'll be getting that for 12 months. We have people that take this survey every single year because they enjoy receiving the research, and they also tell us that it's a big help to them to think through their IT budgets. We see that comment all the time, that this has really helped me ask some better questions in terms of our own budgeting and spending. So it's a win-win, as they say. So please apply.
Andriana, I know we talked right up near the end there, but if you have a quick question or two, we'd be happy to take it. And we'll also be happy to respond to any other questions via email as well.
Yeah.
Sure, very quickly. If the feel is that they will be outsourcing more, why would they increase that much? Why bring in FTEs if they're going to be hiring outside help and the cost increasing?
Well, I think it's a matter of emphasis. So just because you're outsourcing doesn't mean that you don't need more people internally as well. And as we'd indicated earlier, a lot of the outsourcing is for more of those, services that can be delivered, horizontally or more infrastructure oriented. But then I can hire more professionals to work with the business units on business transformation. So I think it's not just, cutting internal headcount, but refocusing it more on things that internal team members can do better than outsiders.
Right. And remember, a lot of these changes are permanent, right? Even though we're going to go back, hopefully, to something normal once we have vaccines, a lot of the ways customers are interacting now are going to be part of their habits going forward. So you need to have those in-house skills permanently as well.
That's right. We're right at the hour.
Anything else, guys?
No, I wish we had more time to answer more questions, but we'd be happy to get to any questions via email.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you from Avasant to all of our attendees as well as our speakers. A replay of today's session will be available shortly on our events page, and we will be emailing all of the slides to everyone shortly. You will also be receiving the report that we covered today via email. We hope to see you again at another digital forum, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.